My name is Leone Musgrave. I study Eurasia and the mountainous Caucasus region in West Asia and Eastern Europe, and this year I am Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. I completed my PhD at Indiana University in Russian and Middle Eastern history in 2017, and I came to Austin from Rostov-on-Don, where I was conducting research in affiliation with Southern Federal University. My research at IHS is about the Caucasus in the transitional period between the fall of the Romanov regime and the consolidation of Soviet power. Well, we have a lot of literature about what happened among other groups and how they aligned, for example, the Ukrainians, during the Russian revolutions, and what this meant later in the Soviet period and the post-Soviet period. What happened in the Caucasus has remained a bit more of a mystery, and that has made it more difficult to understand what has happened since the fall of the Soviet Union. My research, therefore, addresses the question, what were Caucasians' own ideas of revolution, their ideal political and enviroeconomic arrangements in 1905 and 1917, a story that we might expect to be significantly different from groups like the Ukrainians, because the Caucasus was such a linguistically diverse place at this time, also to some extent religiously diverse, and was a place that had only been conquered by Russia and brought into the Russian Empire a generation or two previous to the revolution. So what I found was that Caucasus peoples and practices and ideas of a mountain identity and a mountain state that they tried to implement at this time cut across these linguistic and religious boundaries. Their ideas of social welfare, for example, institutions like Waqf and Zakat, their ideas of natural resource use, and their ideas and practices of collective decision-making complicated Bolshevik attempts to control resources in the region, to industrialize Eurasia, and later to impose their own forms of collectives. In other words, Caucasus peoples largely responded to the Bolshevik arrival in the region as a continuation of the Romanov political and economic regime, rather than as the radical break with Romanovism that some of the more Russia-centered historiography has traditionally depicted it as. And the larger implications of this are, first, that the narrative that we've been telling of the Russian Civil War, in which the Bolsheviks ultimately won because people perceive them as a less imperialist alternative, a lesser of two evils than the whites, is not quite true. Second, as I discovered when I was researching the Russian revolutionary participation of these peoples in the Caucasus, or their opposition to the Russian Revolution, they were involved largely in Ottoman Empire and Persian revolutionary processes as well. And this shows that in order to better understand Russia now, Russia's revolutionary processes at that time, the Soviet Union, we need to think more about how this area was entangled in those Asian stories, and not only read Russian history in the context of a normative European revolution and a European history, as has been more common. Thirdly, Caucasians' attempts to establish this mountain state in the region at the time suggest that the story that we've traditionally told about how nationalism, socialism, and village-level identity or anarchy were the main competitors for the inheritance of empire in West Asia and Eastern Europe at this time is not quite adequate. We know that environmentalism alongside nationalism played a big role in the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, but my research shows that environmental grievances and thoughts about the environment with respect to human security and environmental political imaginaries played a big role in this period, in the end of the Romanov regime and in the early Soviet period as well. Well, the collectives and commons theme appealed to me because much of the politics of the Caucasus in this period had to do with things like the fate of pasture and forests that many Caucasian societies held in common rather than privately. A lot of it also had to do with the challenge that Caucasians' transhumance practices, that is, moving livestock from one side of the mountain range to the other, or from the heights of the mountain range to the plains with the changing of seasons, posed to attempts of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks to consolidate states and hence to their claims at internationalism. And moreover, lots of the politics in the Caucasus at this time had to do with and kind of illustrated what gets counted as governance in different contexts. For example, the parliamentary politics, European style of parties like the Bolsheviks or the Socialist Revolutionaries on the one hand, and on the other, scales of political communities and kinds of political communities that were much different. So, for example, village confederations and Sufi brotherhoods. The themes I'm interested in, broadly speaking, are social and political history from below, pluralism, relations across political borders, or non-national history, and the influence of environment and imagined geography in human life. I have two future projects in mind. The first new project is a longer-term history of the political and enviroeconomic transformation of the Caucasus from the beginning of Russian colonization in the late 18th century to the present. And this project is organized along the lines of specific sectors, the wool, fish, and grape industries. The other project, focusing on one industry in particular, is provisionally called Mineral Waters and Multi-Ethnic Leisure, Native Resources, Russian Resorts. My research profited most in my fellowship year at IHS by being part of a powerful scholarly collective inquiry. I learned about similar regions from Peru and Colombia to Tanzania, Bulgaria, and South Asia. And in fact, one of the first people that I met in the institute was a scholar from the region that I study. And we also began meeting once a week after that. And I think both he and I really benefited from that exchange of ideas and critique of each other's work, as did I from my interactions with the scholars of the institute and the community as a whole.